So Ben and Chad are both working for CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is an organization that assists in the building of a movement which combines community and rights of nature, saying these two rights as two sides of the same coin. Chad Nicholson is the Pennsylvania organizer, and Ben Price has been working for CELDF for a while now and has been doing community organizing for the last 20 years. And together they have co-authored the Pennsylvania Community Rights Cookbook. So with that being said, over to you, Chad and Ben. Feel free to introduce yourself further and get started with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Irene. And thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for inviting us. My name is Ben Price with Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. My friend and colleague here is Chad Nicholson, also with CELDF. And the title of our talk today is The Place of Community and People in the Rights of Nature Movement. And as Irene mentioned, it's part of our mission as an organization to advance community rights, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but also the rights of nature. And our theme today is really, it encompasses how are they connected. What we want to do is do a bit of a presentation of this whole idea of the place of people and communities in the rights of nature movement, talk about some of our background and activism, our organizing with communities around rights of nature, and a number of other things. And we hope to leave some space at the end for some conversation. And so just to kick things off and try to begin, and first off, Chad, did you have anything you'd like to say as introductory wise?
Not a whole lot, other than just thanks to RE-PEAT for the invitation and for putting on PEAT Fest. It's yeah, a really interesting and cool thing that's happening. So thanks, and happy to be here. And also, Ben and I are both based in Pennsylvania, which isn't traditionally seen as a hotbed of environmental activism in Pennsylvania or anywhere else for that matter. And Ben and I live on opposite sides of the state, but there's been some really interesting things that have happened here, including Tamaqua Borough, which we'll get into later in the presentation, which was, as far as we're aware, the first community on Earth, at least in a Western legal system, to give rights to ecosystems. So there's some stuff happening here in places that a lot of folks wouldn't normally expect it to be happening. And so we'll be getting into more of that, but just to kind of locate us a little bit further. And yeah, we do have, want to leave some time at the end for questions and discussion for sure. Also, if things come up, there, I know some people are excited by it, some people get bored by it. There will be some dense concepts that we will be introducing. So if there's something that we do mention that isn't clear, please put things in the chat and we'll try to address them as they go. So yeah, we invite feedback as we go as well. So, all right, thanks. Go ahead, Ben.
All righty, thanks, Chad. Yeah, so when we talk about rights of nature movement, to be clear, our focus has been on working with communities to help them draft and to enact legislation that actually legalizes the rights of nature, that actually puts into law, whether at the municipal level, the county level, and we have some movement on the state level in the state of New York in the US. So most of our organizing has been in the United States. And we have this connection between the rights of nature and the legal system that we're trying to make that bridge, to make that connection. In some ways, it's an unnatural connection. And we'll talk a little bit about indigenous sensibilities and relationship to the natural world. Sometimes I, at least personally, wonder, why do we need a law to tell us not to destroy the planet, not to protect the environment that sustains us? But this rights of nature legislation, it depends on human beings enacting the laws, drafting them in ways that are actually going to create the right outcomes. And in the process of going through this legislative kind of revolution, if you will, because really recognizing rights for ecosystems encompasses quite a revolution against Western philosophies of governance and Western theories of law. So simultaneously with passing rights of nature legislation, we're doing two things that impact the community. We are, in the language of the laws that we have drafted, we actually assign, if you will, guardianship or oversight of a local ecosystem to the community and to the residents, the longstanding residents who live there, whether they're indigenous, Native Americans, or they're not. They may be not indigenous, but still long-term residents of that community are recognized as having the authority to have legal standing in a court of law or any legal administrative process to speak for and on behalf of the ecosystem. And in doing this and putting this kind of an enforcement mechanism in the local laws that we work on, we're also recognizing the people living in that community, not just as advocates for the ecosystem, but as was mentioned in the previous session, that they are members of that ecosystem. They're part of nature. And this is actually, this actually goes against Western philosophy since the days of colonialism, the imperial expansion of empires across the globe. And so it has that effect, a kind of a reuniting of human communities with their natural environment. And seeing them as part of that natural environment, not separate from it, also does something to jettison the idea of human superiority over nature and over other species. And that certainly has played into much of the, I would argue, negative consequences of global expansion of empires and colonialism and so forth. It's a mindset. And rights of nature law requires a change of paradigm, a change of worldview for human beings to embrace it, to understand it, and to really advance it in the way that we're advocating for. And which is, just to say as clearly as I can, rights of nature does not mean preserving nature for the benefit of people and how we can gain more convenience, luxury, enjoyment from the world. Rights of nature legislation is, as we have pursued it, is very clearly and emphatically about rights that are inherent in those ecosystems, in nature as a whole, and regardless of its benefit to humanity. But then again, recognizing that humans are part of the natural world. I'm going to just leave those introductory remarks there and turn it over to Chad to talk about some of the aspects of this work and some of the aspects of rights of nature as an idea.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I know some of this was touched on, at least in the previous session, maybe in other sessions as well. But from our perspective, a lot of our work these days is making sure that rights of nature is not confused with the human right to a healthy environment. And there are big pushes for that, at least in the States, and I've seen it in other countries happening around the world right now as well. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, again, not usually seen as the hotbed of environmental activism, we have what's called the Environmental Rights Amendment, Article 1, Section 27, which was passed in 1972, around the time that a lot of other major environmental legislation was being passed in the United States, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, things like that. But it makes two very important statements and distinctions within that, which is that nature is still seen as property under that, and that nature is there to be used for human benefit. And so it really doesn't have in mind, or in theory or in spirit, the idea that nature itself has a right to exist and flourish independent of any benefit to humans. And so when we try to use these laws to protect the environment, number one, they often aren't upheld by courts. They're seen as essentially, how do we compromise human rights with the destruction of the ecosystem? Basically, how do we destroy the ecosystem less so that humans get some more benefit? But two, culturally, there's still an identification of the places where we live, the ecosystems that we live among, that we're a part of, as property, as seeing them as something to be bought or sold or used or permitted or regulated or anything like that. So, that's kind of the framework that we're coming from here. And, we try to make the best of the systems that we have, the laws that have been in place. But frankly, in the United States and under these laws, it hasn't really worked. The state of the natural environment is much worse today than it was under these initial laws that were passed back in the 70s. And so there is, I think what Ben was saying, there's strictly legal components involved, which is that the law as it was set up to so-called protect the environment is simply not working. But then culturally, we also have to begin changing our mindset and relationship to the places that we live, to not see it as something to be exploited or used, but to see ourselves as a part of it. And so that comes back to, the title of this piece, which is the place of community and people in the rights of nature movement. And Ben and I have both worked in a lot of places where you wouldn't think of them as being particularly progressive, at least in terms of environmental protection. A lot of them would be viewed, at least from the outside, as conservative. A lot of communities that we worked in have voted for Trump. A lot of communities are pro-gun that we've worked in. A lot of rural, frankly, white areas, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country. And yet these people a lot of them that we've worked with have a pretty distinct and relevant connection to the natural world. And I personally never, ask anybody what their political affiliation or connection is. It doesn't matter to me, at least in terms of protection of the ecosystems. And I think that's, our approach to that has led to some interesting coalitions and affiliations where people can all agree that they don't want the ecosystems, the watersheds, the forests, the marshes and wetlands to be harmed in the places where they live for very, in some ways practical reasons. But also they live among these. They have grown up there. A lot of these folks have ties to the place, have ties, and they have history, they have family, they have connections. And so there is a much deeper connection to place in a lot of the communities that we worked. Once we get to know people, even if on the outside, it wouldn't appear that maybe they would be in alignment with what, is sometimes seen as radically progressive environmental laws or movements based on rights of nature. So I think, just to give a little more background on that, a lot of the work in Pennsylvania that has expanded across the world in many places has come out of communities that we wouldn't have expected to have come out of. But it's still based on place, and it's based on people understanding that they are a part of the community that they live, the natural community, and not separate from it. And it's very common sense, I think, for a lot of the people we've worked with, where they just say, yeah, of course, nature should have rights. In some ways, for a lot of the folks that I've worked with, I didn't expect them to be as receptive or amenable to these concepts. There is an immediate connection between themselves and the place where they live, because they're in the place, they see it every day, they have history, they have connections. And so the introduction of rights of nature has been, I think, easier and maybe more deeply felt and understood in places where I wouldn't have originally expected it to be. And that has allowed an outgrowth of the legal change, as well as, that cultural change that we're talking about, and that it's from these communities, it's not just about them. They're also providing roadmaps, guidelines, inspiration to other folks in other places about what their own connections to the ecosystem and the places around them can be. So, but I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, well, and maybe it makes sense to talk at this point about some of the communities that we've worked in as examples of just what Chad's talking about. It is a little bit counterintuitive to think that in communities that would be very critical of environmental sentiments, we're used to hearing terms like we're tree huggers, and the rest of it. You've all heard various terms of critiquing the environmentally committed folks. But we, as Chad said, we've worked with communities, and the very first one that ever enacted a rights of nature law, that actually passed a law that recognized that an ecosystem had its own rights, and that those rights were enforceable by the community recognizing those rights, was Tamaqua. It's a borough in Pennsylvania, and it's situated in anthracite coal country. In other words, this is an area that about 150 or so years ago, when hard coal, anthracite, was found in the region, it was mined. The mining corporations owned and ran the communities pretty much. They built towns for the workers in the mines. They built railroad lines to haul the coal out. It was very much the hotbed and the support for the Industrial Revolution as it unfolded in the United States. This is a community that in 2006 we heard from, because they heard about a plan that the governor of Pennsylvania and New Jersey had agreed upon to dredge the Hudson and Delaware rivers and bring the dredge in mixed with fly ash from coal-fired power plants, and use that waste to fill in open mines that had been abandoned since the coal was stripped out. The plan was, they called it mine reclamation, as though it were somehow an actual reclamation and remediation of harms done, when in fact it was the introduction of PCB-laden dredge, of mercury-laden fly ash, all kinds of nasty material. The community was very concerned, would leach into their drinking water, because the plan was to drop it into the Springdale pit in Tamaqua, just up above where the high school is. And I was approached by Kathy Miarelli, who at the time was a nurse at the high school. And she thought it would be really wonderfully horrible for that stuff to be brought in and to have the kids exposed to it. When we talk about the opposition to rights of nature, especially here in the US, it's usually around property interest. And the property interest, what I'm talking about is that the mine was owned and the permits were issued to a company, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation, and they were going to profit by bringing this waste in and filling the holes in. They were going to be subsidized by two states, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. They had a real interest in having that happen. The problem for the borough of Tamaqua and for their borough council, it's a small town in this area, is that they really couldn't pass a local law that forbade the corporation from using its own property any way it wanted to, because property rights supersede other rights. And so the question that I was presented with as a community organizer was, well, what can we do? And we'd been having discussions on staff about, for instance, Christopher Stone's book, Should Trees Have Standing, which you all may be familiar with. But at any rate, the question was, what if ecosystems had legal rights of their own and that those rights could be enforced? And I raised that question with Kathy Miarelli, who, as a matter of fact, was on borough council at the time. We talked about it and really couldn't figure out any way we would be able to defeat this plan, this project, given that the rights of the corporation to exercise its property rights and the power of the state that was behind them was going to be far more than the borough could overcome legally. Again, this is a community that was not particularly environmentally focused, but they sure as heck were interested in the health of their own children. And they wanted to stop this thing. One of the other problems we have is that corporations are recognized as legal persons under the law. And as such, they're protected against municipalities passing laws that somehow deprive them of their property interests. And so the rights of nature turned out to be a pragmatic proposal, a suggestion that what if we recognize this ecosystem to have these rights, and that way it can be, on the legal scale at least, be weighed against the rights that the corporation was claiming. And we passed that, worked on drafting that law, and the Borough Council passed it in September of 2006. As far as we know, it's the first time an ecosystem was recognized to have rights of its own that were enforceable by the community, anywhere, at least in Western law. We understand, of course, that indigenous communities have recognized the rights and the right relationship with nature for time out of mind. So Tamaqua was an interesting beginning for us. It was not, as Chad was mentioning, a kind of place that you would necessarily expect would stand up and say, we'll be the first to recognize ecosystems of having fundamental legal rights that the community in which they're situated can be enforced. And of course, that led to other things. Little Tamaqua, very small community in Pennsylvania, didn't expect that what they did would have any lasting effect. Matter of fact, they weren't sure that it would be noticed at all, or that the corporation would pay any attention to it. I can tell you that today they still have not received any of that dredge material. It has not been brought in. I can't say that the corporation or New Jersey and Pennsylvania kind of waved the white flag and said, oh, well, rights of nature, we can't fight that. They did not do that. But they did not come in and violate the law, and it's still on the books. It's still there. What's interesting is that there was that story about Tamaqua came out, and it was shared and it was heard about within another year or two by folks in Ecuador. And I'm going to.
Sleeping on the chair.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, my cat stepped on my keyboard and unmuted me. Go ahead, Ben.
That's okay. Well, hello to the cat. And see, nature intervenes always. But anyway, Chad, maybe I'll turn it over to you for a minute, and you can pick up with the story from there a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, Ben, obviously fill me in because you're more involved with the Ecuadorian effort. But yeah, so what happened in Little Tamaqua Borough, less than 1,000 people literally in the community that passed this law, it made a splash. And like Ben said, they didn't necessarily expect that it would go anywhere or do anything. It was more a representation of their values at the time. But folks in Ecuador and around the world heard about it and invited, including Ben and other members of our organization and several other organizations, to work with the Constitutional Assembly down there, which was putting together a new draft of a constitution for the people of Ecuador, which included rights of nature provisions, which was then popularly adopted by the country in 2008. And so there's a lot of credit to go around, both in terms of where the principles come from for rights of nature, which includes other cultures and people that have different relationships to the land than a lot of us do in Western culture, including in Tamaqua. Also, credit goes to the folks in Tamaqua, credit goes to the folks in Ecuador to put it together, a lot of the groups that were involved. But at the end of the day, I think the lesson that I usually take from this at the early stage of the beginning of rights of nature being introduced into a Western legal construct is people in a rural small community in Pennsylvania that is not seen as an environmental hotbed took bold action about something that was important to them and did what most people at the time thought was frankly some crazy shit. Like, what is this like that you're doing? And within a couple of years, that was picked up and dropped into and voted on into a national constitution in Ecuador. And I guess for me, there's a lot of lessons in this, but one of the main ones these days is I hear a lot of despair from people in communities that I work with from around, in Pennsylvania, but also around the world, particularly among youth, of what can we do? How are any actions that we take really going to have any major impact on the scale and the scope of the problems that we're facing? And I share in a lot of that despair. And I also come back to this frequently, which is that if you take bold action on what it is you care about and are willing to do things outside of the parameters that the law or your culture even have set for you, to take a stand on what you believe is important and what needs to happen now as well as for the future, it is possible that that will have impacts, far-reaching impacts in your community, but also in another hemisphere, in the case of going from Tamaqua to, Ecuador. And so, and it's also not, we'll get a little bit more into the, sorry, I was just reading the chat, the specifics of what it means, but it hasn't just been words on paper either. As Ben mentioned, the law that was passed in Tamaqua, who knows whether that was the thing that kept the sludge out, or whether maybe they decided to just go somewhere else. But there's still no sludge there. In Ecuador, there's been several decisions over the last 10, 15 years at this point that have stopped mining projects, that have stopped highway projects. We're going to talk a little bit more later on. We don't have a ton of time here, obviously, but about what we're calling the Los Cedros decision. It was a decision put out earlier this year, using the Ecuadorian constitutional rights of nature language to enforce rights of nature, and also to further define what the relationship looks like between people and ecosystems. And I mean, it's a very long ruling. We did a webinar on it at CELDF earlier this year, where we actually went into it, we read through it and kind of parsed it out. Talks about a lot of things that are relevant to this stuff, and it sets out what is a new vision and a new framework for what a legal system based on rights of nature would look like. And so the point being, these aren't just words on paper. They're not even just like good ideas. They're actually being actualized and enforced, both at the local level as well as at the national level. And there's several other communities that we can get into with stories here, because to come back to what we're doing with this presentation, that it is the relationship to place. It is the relationship of the community and the people living there to their natural environment that really makes this stuff real. And if there isn't that connection to place, if there isn't that connection to what, where we're living, how we're living, and how it's affecting us, then most of this stuff can just come down to academic conversations. It can just come down to words on paper. There are a lot of smart people out there, much smarter than me, that have a lot better ideas for what a better relationship would look like to the natural world, to environmental protection, to stopping climate change, to XYZ. I could spend the rest of the time just listing off the problems that need to be solved. But if people aren't affected, directly by these things, and if they're not willing to take action in the places where they live, all the words on paper and all the good ideas really are meaningless at the end of the day, at least as far as I'm concerned. And so it's important to have the discussions, but if there's not a way to actualize them or find ways to organize on the ground to make them real, to inspire people, to have them actually feel a part of something bigger than them, I don't know what it's worth. And so the Tamaqua to Ecuador link is something that I always come back to, because maybe it didn't go anywhere, but you never know unless you take that step, or unless you try, or unless you do something that is going to be outside the bounds that we're traditionally told right now are where we need to stay. That we need to look to Joe Biden, or we need to look to the UN or whoever else. And I'm not saying that there aren't, ways for us to work within those spheres, but also there are ways outside of those spheres where we potentially can be much more effective and have much larger change, both legally and culturally, on a larger scale than working within the bounds that we were given. So then I don't know if you wanted to go back into or expand on that, or other communities.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. I think that it does kind of open the door for some other, for advancement of those thoughts. If you think about who should be making decisions for nature? Who should be calling the shots? Who should enforce rights if they are recognized? And what we've been suggesting is that it should be the people living in the community, and I mean the natural community, as part of nature, as part of the local ecosystem. That's who should have the voice in enforcing those laws. And I partly in response to some of the questions that have been posed in the chat, and we'll come back to them in more detail. But it really is about recognizing the place of people within nature and taking it seriously that they are part of it, and that when a particular local environment has its rights violated by some extractive industry, by some toxic deposit, some poisoning that's been that has been happened as a result of profit making, of course, then who is being harmed? Well, it's not just the environment, of course, it's people too, but it's those people who live there. Everything that is happening to the earth, everything that is causing the climate crisis, everything that is causing the huge die-off of species around the globe, every one of the problems that's causing that is happening in some real place, in some community adjacent to or right in the midst of human beings who are denied the authority and the right, the legal power to do anything about it. What we're saying is that's got to change. And so part of our community rights work is advocating for the right of local self-government of communities. And that means indigenous people, of course, absolutely. That is a continuation of that struggle. But it also means the non-indigenous people, the people who are the permanent residents of a community, are part of that local environment. And I don't know that we generally think of it that way. Sometimes, progressive mind is likely to say, well, where's the most clout? Where can we bring the most coercive force, essentially, to make people behave and not kill the environment, not do harm to it? So that's obviously got to be a central government, some bureaucratic agency, that kind of thing. That's not what we're saying, because in fact, those agencies and those administrations change over time, and politically they change, and the tides of politics aren't with nature, obviously. And so the people who actually are going to be impacted directly by decisions that affect their local environment, that is who we're talking about. That's the place of community and people in the rights of nature movement that we're pointing to. And I assume we're probably going to wind down here a little bit pretty soon, because so we have some time for conversation. But another community that I worked in a few years back was Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And by the way, they're not all in Pennsylvania that we've worked, plenty of places, but in Pittsburgh, fairly large, was an industrial town, a steel town. They were noted in the United States for being a smog blanketed city, that you could hardly see the city skyscape. You couldn't see the place during the day because the air quality was so bad. They have done a lot over the years to change that, to clean things up. And of course, a lot of it had to do with globalization and the loss of their industry base in the city. But they've cleaned things up, and they've spent a lot of effort reclaiming brownfields and getting rid of toxins and cleaning up the Monongahela River where they get their drinking water. And they were concerned when fracking became the big boom in Pennsylvania that might occur in their community, and they didn't want it to happen. As a matter of fact, there were contracts on land within the city to be fracked, to have gas extracted from the ground and pipelines built and so forth. So we worked with the city council with 2 out of 9 in favor of stopping the fracking to start with. We worked with the 9 neighborhood councils. They are not, they don't have any political power, but they're advisory to the city council. And those neighborhood groups, I met with them and organized with them, and we put an immense amount of political pressure on city council to enact a law that not only banned the fracking, but recognized the rights of ecosystems within the city. And that was done in the end unanimously by a vote of city council. That law is still on the books, even though the state of Pennsylvania said that it was forbidden for them to pass the law, and they did it anyway.
Also, Ben, quick question put out to the group. Does anybody know who leased land for fracking in the city at that time and who one of the largest parcel owners is in the city?
No.
You might be surprised.
Well, it's the Catholic Church in a cemetery.
The cemetery, the large Catholic cemetery, was leased out for fracking.
How am I not surprised? I don't know why, but I wasn't surprised by that.
It's a little strange and in some ways comical, but I won't even, I won't, no, I'm not going to repeat some of the jokes, but at any rate, yes, so it was against the advice of council of the city, against the preemption of the state, and against the threats of lawsuits by the industry. The law was passed. No litigation occurred. The state did not overturn the law. It's still on the books. That was 2010, so it's been a while. What we're saying is that it takes boldness. It takes standing up and challenging the system as it is to actually achieve rights of nature in many places, especially where there is opposition to the very idea of diminishing absolute rights connected with property. And that is one of the largest stumbling blocks for enacting rights of nature legislation.
So then we're getting some interesting questions and stuff that I think would be good for discussion, including about finances and also how to partner with religious communities like the Catholic Church, because we definitely do work with religious communities as well. But I'm wondering if we want to, if you're all right with it, I want to put up that quick graph basically to show how rights of nature has exploded, and then maybe we lead into it with there was a question earlier on about what does the enforcement look like at the community level, whether it's in terms of personhood or creating guardianship council, and maybe you could like tip off with that into the discussion. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, let's go ahead.
So I'm going to do this very quickly, and this is more of just kind of something that I often do at the end of discussions, which is to try to inspire folks, you know, basically to say, all right, it's not just Tamaqua, it's not just Ecuador, but that this work has expanded and changed very quickly within the last 10 or 15 years and has had, you know, real impacts on communities to stop environmental harm, and not just stop things, but also to put into place new governing structures, new community structures that are about empowering people to, you know, actively work within their environment to protect it and to be a part of it. And so I'm going to just show this graph real quickly, and it's really just, it's intended to just kind of inspire. Let me see. It is here. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to say, you know, here's Tamaqua down here in the bottom around 2006, which was, you know, the first community, at least in the Western construct, that put rights of nature into law. That then passed over to Ecuador in 2008. These are other communities that have been passing laws in the meantime on a variety of issues. So even though rights of nature is a part of it, you know, these are different issues. It may be fracking, it may be factory farms, it may be sewage sludge dumping, it may be pipelines, it may be toxic waste, all these things. And this isn't like a particular metric that we're using here, but just to show that within 10 or 15 years, the number of communities and the number of places that this is spread to is quite significant. You know, it started in small PA, it went to Ecuador, there's Bolivia, there's other firsts here around the first, you know, at least in the United States, first time that an ecosystem tried to intervene into a federal lawsuit. New Zealand, Brazil, the Colorado River, the Ho-Chunk Nation, Colombia, I mean, Uganda. There's like a whole bunch of different ways that this is expanded, which at least from, you know, where I think we sit is that it indicates that a real movement is taking off. And that when Tamaqua did this, the question that was usually, well, it wasn't even a question, it was a statement. It's like, you can't do something like that. It's basically a gimmick. It then has moved into more of a question of like, well, can we do that? You know, like it got past the psychological block of it being completely impossible to do to, okay, well, maybe we can we do it? And it feels like in the terms of movement building where we're at now, is it's not just can we do it, it's like, well, it's going to be done. The question is, how are we going to do it? What's it going to look like? What are the enforcement mechanisms? What are the principles involved? What is rights of nature versus a human right to a healthy environment? You know, kind of more of the clarification of what this movement and what rights of nature actually means and looks like. So, and it's happened, you know, since 2006, 15 years or so. And so a lot has happened. The questions have evolved very quickly, and it feels like in some ways that's where we're at, you know, regarding this conference, regarding the communities we're working with. What does this actually mean now? How is it going to be enforced? Where do we go from here? So Ben, I didn't know if you wanted to maybe get at that enforcement question a little bit, at least with the stuff that we've been doing in Cincinnati or Reading, then maybe we can get to the other questions.
Very good, thank you. So yeah, we do track the work we've been doing around the country and around the world, really, and kind of have a sense of a movement that is building. But it's a really important question. How can we enforce it? As Chad was saying earlier, what's the point if it's just ink on paper? That's not a law if it's not being enforced. And enforcement means that there are actually consequences for breaking the law, for violating the rights of an ecosystem. And how can that be? Well, we've puzzled over it quite a while, and originally in our early ordinances, it was even the rights that we designated were pretty basic, that an ecosystem essentially has the right to exist, to flourish, to naturally evolve, and to be restored if it's damaged, with the culprit, whoever did the harm, being responsible for funding the repair, whatever remediation is needed. That, of course, hasn't been, those enforcement mechanisms have not been enforced by the courts. Usually it's a litigation is what brings these ordinances out into the public when a corporation who does not like being held responsible for not killing off the local environment sues to overturn the law and say that you can't violate our property rights by passing this law and making us responsible for not harming the trees, the river, the air, that kind of thing. So we have looked at other mechanisms. And of course, there's arguments, there's interest in around the world in how to enforce that as well. Today, we have begun to put together model laws in a couple of communities in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Reading, Pennsylvania. We have put together local laws for those communities that include the creation of a local environmental advocate, someone who is from the community, lives in the community, is part of that ecosystem, in other words, who is chosen by the community to represent and speak for and to investigate claims of violations of environmental rights, rights of the environment, that is. And also environmental courts, locally constituted courts that would hear cases. In other words, the community in which the violation has taken place would be the place where any kind of a hearing, a trial, would be held. It would not be left up to someone or some group or some judge with no connection to the ecosystem, but only to the law. Because we already know that the law as it stands protects the privileges of property over the rights of people and the rights of nature. That simply is how the law is exercised at this point. And so these enforcement mechanisms, they're new. They have not really been tested, but just like the rights of nature as an idea itself had never been tested before. And now we see globally the normalization of the idea of rights for ecosystems. But I think that it's important that we also talk about specific kinds of rights. And one of the issues, for instance, in New Zealand, when the Maori people and the Crown government finally came to terms and recognized rights for the Wanganui River, they did so on the level of legal personhood, that the river was recognized by the Crown government as a legal person, which very much is in line with how corporate property is recognized as a legal person, and in many places around the world. We find that to be somewhat problematic, although it's sure better than not having rights for the Wanganui River. But personhood traditionally in legal terms bears not only certain rights like the right to sue and be sued. The right to be sued is not much of a right for a river to gain. And we can think of scenarios, for instance, where a developer puts up a lot of new structures, the river floods, wipes out those structures, and the developer sues the river for damages to replace, to pay for the lost property interest. Well, river doesn't have a bank account unless there has been other litigation where a polluter has been fined and funds have gone into a fund that would be solely for the return of the river to its prior pristine state. Now there's money involved, and now that can be gone after an illegal proceeding. We would argue that when we get into any kind of enforcement, we need to be very careful about how we define what those rights are. Are they a different kind of right? Are they specific rights specific to the ecosystem, or are they rights that come under the jurisdiction of the courts in whatever nation it might be, where those legal traditions actually limit the extent of the rights of ecosystems simply by tradition. And personhood is one of those possible ways that could happen. So I'm afraid of running out of time here before we actually let others speak. So maybe I should just leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Chad and Ben. I have seen a few questions in the chat, a few of them by Bianca. Bianca, perhaps you would like to unmute yourself and ask your most pressing one.
Oh, okay. Let me well, I guess like in the beginning of your talk you mentioned you outlined like the inherent rights, and I'm not sure if you actually like responded to this question already, but how do you know and recognize which rights are inherent? For example, like if you're looking more specifically like for a peatland or something like that, or yeah, how does that process work? And also who decides it?
The unfortunate fact is that we're talking about human law in all of this stuff. And it's human language that defines what these rights are. And that may not be adequate, quite frankly. And an indigenous perspective is, in my view personally, more valuable in this way. But I think that it makes sense that we understand that the ecosystem as it is now, its preservation as it is and as it unfolds naturally without human interference, that's the basic, that's the kind of the foundational rights that we're talking about. The right, in some ways, the right to be left alone, the right not to be altered to the extent that that existing processes and systems can't continue.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Although what you said about the right to be left alone, I'm sure like a lot of the speakers that we've had before have mentioned all of these rights of nature declarations should be catered to the specific like ecosystem or groups of communities of people. So perhaps a lot of these communities or ecosystems benefit maybe from having human interaction on them. And it might be, yeah, kind of not the best thing to have humans completely shunned or evicted out of their these areas. Yeah, so maybe
Let me
just
be really clear about that. No, that's not at all as I'm conceiving it, because I really mean it when I say human beings are part of nature. They're one of the species in the ecosystem. And so and this is a real concern when it comes to the mutation of rights of nature into something it shouldn't be, in my view, which is using it in a way, say, we're going to remove the indigenous people from this ecosystem to preserve it as a national park or something. Well, that's not rights of nature. That's still the use of nature for people, as a recreational thing, as opposed to people living within that ecosystem naturally, which, when living naturally, generally means not killing it.
If it's okay, unless there's more follow-up on that, I wanted to respond to what I thought was an important question by Deborah regarding the church and the role of institutions, which is, it doesn't matter what issue we're working on or where we're working, we're usually opposed the most by whatever institutions in those areas will be most threatened by further community involvement or engagement. So in Pittsburgh, for example, I think we would distinguish between the Catholic Church as an institution, as an entity that's held power here for a long time, versus the people in individual congregations, the ones that are community-based, that are, churches within a community. And we also talk about this distinction a lot with other environmental groups that we work with in the United States, that oftentimes say, for example, whatever you think about them, the Sierra Club has a different perspective and set of values at the leadership at the top level than a lot of the chapters do at the local level. We've seen pushback from environmental or progressive groups in more liberal areas because those groups would be offended or potentially threatened by more grassroots involvement. We've seen pushback from conservative or Republican groups. It really depends on who holds power in the areas and if they feel like it's going to be threatened by more community engagement. And so we often distinguish between the institution itself, especially the top-down ones, versus the people that are within them and the people that are within them at the community, the local level. So,
right, and just to say that I'm actually working currently with it's a coalition of Catholic nuns in the Hudson River Valley in the state of New York. They're interested in enacting a rights of the Hudson. And so that's a whole different perspective. It's not focused on, as in Pittsburgh, it's unfortunately a financial issue for the church there. They saw some income to be made.
One more question from Frankie, and then I think we will have to start wrapping it up here. Frankie?
I just had a question about
I don't know what happened, but I think she'll be back in a minute.
I'm just going to ask it like this because I have two Zooms on, so otherwise it makes that weird thing. So I had a question about if I know you said that the community will always take care of the ecosystem, or you said something along the lines of like the people that are living there are going to take best care of it. Have you ever seen examples of where that's not the case, where people actually do end up getting rights and then abusing the rights?
No, not that scenario, but it is true that in any given community, there may be one individual who is the predominant landholder, someone who owns a lot of land and is interested in profiting from the use of that land for whatever the purpose might be. We've certainly had numbers of controversies in that area. There, the question is, in a democratic process, is it 1 acre, 1 vote, or 1 person, 1 vote? And if it's 1 acre, and unfortunately, much Western law is built around rights attached to property. And a lot of US law recognizes the rights of the largest landholder in an area over the rights of the whole community. And that is problematic. And that's actually a violation of the rights of nature, if you will.
And yeah, it's a great question though. And I think I don't know if I've seen particular situations where a community has acted not in the best interest of the environment, but it's also, I think, a really important question to put into context. I mean, in Pennsylvania, it's been highly industrial for many years, whether it was coal, railroads, agriculture, timber, oil and gas, I mean, the list goes on. And a lot of communities have essentially been subservient to these industries for a long time. They've had company towns where the company basically, employs people and tells them what to buy, where they live, all that stuff. And so it's also difficult getting people, like when they become dependent on, in many ways, for their livelihood in industry. In some ways they do act, I think, against what may be their best long-term interests because they don't have better options in the short term. And also there's been a history of it. Like you can definitely tell communities in Pennsylvania that have gone through coal to railroads to oil and gas, there's just a mindset that you don't have other options. And that if you do try to resist or create other options, you get the pantsuit off of you or you lose your job and you're told to go away. And so, I mean, it's difficult psychologically, I think, for people in some ways that have been beaten down to understand what their other options are because they've been told they don't have any. And so anyway, I think sometimes, at least in the short term, some folks may make some environmental decisions that aren't in their best interest, but we also haven't really tried real community governance or democracy around these things over time. And I think it would be a very different set of decisions if people truly did have power and authority.